Today we're going to be talking about my favorite obscure philosopher, Philo of Alexandria. In fact, if you've looked at the YouTube videos of this class, you'll probably realize my name in YouTube is Philo of Alexandria. So he's a hero of mine in particular, not because I agree with Philo in a lot of cases, but because it seems to me he has actually a very deep insight into a variety of questions and brings them out, you might say, brings out presuppositions of certain philosophical positions really clearly. In that way, I think he's illuminating, even if you decide he's completely wrong and the presuppositions are crazy. Nevertheless, you can see a lot about the structure of a certain kind of philosophical position. And from another point of view, what he constructs is actually a really stable and really important philosophical position. Now, Philo is somebody who was a contemporary of Jesus, actually, so we're going back in time now. He lives from roughly 20 BC to 40 AD. He lives in Alexandria. He is a Hellenized Jew. In other words, a Jewish citizen of Alexandria in Egypt, speaking Greek, reading and writing Greek, with a thorough knowledge of the Hebrew scriptures, but also a thorough knowledge of Platonic philosophy. And his project is to put the two together. So he writes a variety of books that are basically books of allegorical scriptural interpretation. He says, look, here's what the story is, how do we interpret this seemingly bizarre story, and then he writes a treatise about how to interpret this in often wild philosophical ways. Now, maybe that's why I'm so attracted to Philo. He's a sort of wild philosopher who comes up with wild theories, and I'm always a fan of that. But it seems to me he's doing something else that's really important historically. He is maybe the first person to take the Judeo-Christian tradition, in this case just a knowledge of the Hebrew scriptures, together with Platonic philosophy and try to mash them together to form a sort of philosophical and theological synthesis of those two positions. Now, his works are not primarily philosophical. They have titles like The Special Laws, or concerning Noah's work as a planter, or things like that don't sound particularly philosophical. In fact, my favorite work of his is called On Drunkenness, which is one of the great sources of skeptical arguments in the ancient world, along with Sextus Empiricus. Philo on drunkenness basically says, actually starts with a story about Noah, and then he goes on to say, well, yeah, so is the world really the way it appears to us when we're drunk? Or is it really the way it appears to us when we're sober? And they said, well, how do we know anything anyway? How do we know what the world is really like? And he develops quite a few interesting arguments. Anyway, today we're not going to be looking at that. We're going to look at three aspects of his thought that are not skeptical, but actually develop a form of thinking. So first of all, I want to focus on his tweak on Plato and how he accomplishes a transformation of a doctrine that by then had fallen into some philosophical disrepute. As we had seen when we talked about Plato, there are certain problems that face the Platonic philosophical position that within a generation or two have really led people in the academy itself to abandon Plato's thought. Now, the way I was describing this is in the following terms. Imagine that this is a mind, and here in the mind is some kind of thought, some mental event, some mental actuality is taking place, a thought of something, and let's say that is something prompted by a perception of an object in the outside world. So here's the object, a banana in one of our treatments of this. And so we've got the object, a thought, hey, that's a banana. The thought has a certain content. And so, abstracting away from the banana in particular, the thought has a certain content, like, aha, that's a banana. And how is it possible for the thought to have that content? Well, it's got to reflect some concept in the mind. So we've got some sort of concept. But that concept isn't the full explanation. You have this concept, I have another concept maybe, somebody else has a different concept, and yet we want to say we're all thinking the same thought. Hey, that's a banana. The content we want to identify, we want to say your thought has the same content that my thought has, and that's possible only if there's some relation between the concept as it exists in your mind and the concept as it exists in somebody else's mind. So the thought is this concept actually relates to something that Plato calls the form outside. And the arrow has to be drawn this way. I am capable of having that concept by virtue of having some kind of contact with the form. It's the form's causal power that enables me to think the thought about the object, a thought that has content, and attribute some property to the object. Now, by the time Philo is writing, it becomes obvious that this account can't be right for all sorts of things in the world, where really our concept of the object comes from the object in particular. There's no way to think this is really in some way built into the mind, or it seems like an embarrassment to think they're actually forms of all these things. And Philo himself, he's worried about the form of mud, which after all doesn't seem to touch form. But there are all sorts of other things, like this. What is this? It's a phone, yes. Now, do you think in Platonic heaven somewhere there is the form of a phone? And it's like, aha, I'm able to think the thought that this is a phone because I'm some way affected by the form? That seems implausible, right? What about chalk? Is there a form of chalk? Now, there might be, but increasingly people came to think, well, look, yeah, of course, people come up with new inventions all the time. They come up with ideas of things they've never thought of. Somebody was the first person to actually think of making chalk, right? I don't know who the inventor of chalk was. Recently, there was a newspaper article I read about the 100th anniversary of the zipper, okay? And the inventor of the zipper is actually this pretty obscure character. Things like television, cell phones, and so on, there's no one inventor. They're produced by lots of people, teams of people, but they're invented. And so you might say, yeah, well, these inventions, surely it's not that there's some abstract form of these things existing from eternity that finally is instantiated. But you might say there are certain basic forms, certain basic concepts that are in some ways combined. Okay, so the thought would be, all right, yes, we gain the concept of a cell phone or a piece of chalk or something like that from experience. But there are certain basic things, certain basic ideas that we have, certain, you might say, innate concepts. And so the thought is, some of these are innate. Now, not the concept of a piece of chalk or a banana or a cell phone, but some of these concepts are innate, and those are the ones that really correspond to forms. At least in a certain version of Plato, that becomes the view. So yeah, lots of concepts actually come in the Aristotelian way. We have perceptions of the objects. The perception of the object gives rise to a certain concept, in some way through abstraction and a variety of other ways that empiricists describe. But the empiricists can't be right about everything. Okay? For example, what would be candidates for some of these basic forms?
Oh, sorry. Symmetry? Equality.
Oh, okay. Identity, equality, yes. That could be something you think of as, yeah, look, this piece of chalk, I say, is equal to itself. Okay? It is self-identical. Is the concept of identity something we get from experience? Well, the empiricists will say yes, but it's a plausible thought to say, no, I mean, what kind of experience would lead me to think about identity? Something like identity or equality. You mentioned symmetry. I like to observe symmetry in experience, but actually Plato likes the mathematical examples because he thinks, yeah, what about a point? It's a very simple example, much simpler than symmetry. Do I ever encounter a point? Something that itself is dimensionless, it's just a position? Well, Plato says, no. That's something that I'm able to think about because I already have certain concepts. And so things like identity, unity, maybe basic things in geometry like a point, or a unit, to think in terms of arithmetic and number. And then later Platonists fill in this sort of account in all sorts of different ways. The concept of an object, the concept of a property itself, the concept of a relationship. Let's see, in Leibniz, things like pleasure, pain. Yes, we experience those things, but the good, a variety of things like that are really thought to be basic forms. Well, however that may be, as we saw earlier when we were discussing this theory, we've got an obvious problem. Let's say that two people disagree about what the true form of, let's say, the good or justice or an object is. How do they sort this out? Whose concept corresponds to the way the form actually is, and whose is a counterfeit? Let's take two people who disagree about what justice is. How do we tell which one is really reflecting the form of justice? Is there any way to tell? Yeah.
Justice is an abstract concept. It's not a real thing.
Ah, good. So once we look toward these basic things, they're going to get more and more abstract. You might say, suppose two people disagree about a banana. That's a little hard to imagine, but a plantain, okay? These two people see the plant says, that's a banana. And the other says, no, it's not. I said, but look, it's the shape of a banana. The other says, yeah, look, it's hard as a rock. And the other says, well, it's more or less the color of a banana. I said, well, it's not exactly the color of a banana. I mean, it's kind of darker than bananas, don't you think? But look at anyway, so these two people disagree about whether this plantain is or is not a banana. How do we sort this out? How do we sort that out? Yeah.
It seems relatively impossible because if one person says that something is just and another doesn't, then our perception of whether it's just or not is going to depend on whether or not our concept of justice is similar to person A or person B's or who we side on. It seems everything is relative in that sense, to us at least.
Ooh, okay, so good. With the banana or with justice, here's one way. Just see what other people say, right? Do people call plantains bananas? Is a plantain a kind of banana or not? And you could just survey linguistic usage. So you might think you're basically doing lexicography. Do people disagree about justice? You say, well, let's take a survey. Do you think that's just? Do you think that's fair? And we do what basically people do when they're making up dictionaries. They try to gauge usage. So maybe we can do that. And that's indeed one way to look at things. That's the way empiricists might go about this, to say, well, all right, people might have different concepts. They use language in different ways. Let's find out what the proper way to use the language is. And sometimes that will sort things out. Is that the only thing we can do? Yeah.
Well, I think with that, defining justice in that way, I think that someone has to be right, because saying that justice is something or something else is an opinion. And even then backing up from that and saying, well, maybe both of them are right. That in itself is also someone's truth. So I think that with that, someone's got to be right.
Okay, so, yeah. One person A says this is justice, person B says this is, person C says, well, I don't know, but it's either A or B. And you find out maybe some people are using the term justice this way, some are using it that way. Indeed, often you end up saying, well, that means justice is ambiguous, right? And often makers of dictionaries say that. Some people use the term this way, some use it that way. So indeed, we might be enough. Yeah.
I don't think Philo would say that you can determine what the forms are by a sheer democratic will. Even though they are abstract, they are accessible to a certain degree. And so in the dialogues, we see that through the exercise of reason, through like a dialectic with this pursuit of what is true, you can determine to some extent what justice is.
Oh, good. Now, yeah, Plato, look, if you are going to just take a survey, who needs the forms, right? You're just looking at the concepts in people's heads, and you're saying, well, we want concepts to be used generally more or less the same way, so we'll just do a survey. What's your concept of this? And so on. The form is doing no work at all then. Surely Plato is introducing this to do some work. The idea is supposed to be, there are objective truths about what is or is not a banana, what is or is not just. And those objective truths aren't a matter of just seeing how people use language. It's really finding out what truly has the property. And in the dialogues, you find Socrates investigating this. Oh, you think this is just? Well, then what do you think about the following? Right? The Chrysippicus says, look, justice is just what is in the interest of the stronger. And it's interesting to see what Socrates does. He doesn't just give counterexamples. Oh, think about, well, historically here, Stalin. You mean that's just? What he does is say, oh, is it what's really in the interest of the stronger? Or what appears to the stronger person to be in his or her interest? And all of a sudden, Chrysippicus has to make a choice and finds that he's going to be in trouble whichever way he goes. Now, some of these ideas, in other words, are going to self-destruct, he thinks, when we investigate this. But of course, some might not. Some might be fully consistent ways of thinking about justice. So some, he thinks, he can argue out on the basis of purely, you might say, philosophical considerations. But maybe not all of them. Yeah, let's go.
I think you might say that the forms are fundamentally one. That's the difference between the banana and justice. And this is why the good is so important to Plato, because the good is the form that determines all the other forms, and thus justice, beauty, and the like. You can get at one form by looking at what you consider to be clearer about another form. Since they're fundamentally one, if you say, oh, that's a good situation, that's a bad situation, the more you can determine one form, the better you get at determining another form.
Okay, excellent. The form here is a unity. It's one thing. And so in linguistic usage, as we've seen, it's not necessarily that way. Concepts aren't necessarily like that. People might have multiple concepts in common usage. Maybe one person even has two different concepts and asks whether a plantain is a banana. They end up saying, gee, I don't know, kind of, right? I have these two ideas, and one is something you find in the grocery store on the banana aisle. This is sort of there, but it's called something different. I don't know what to say. So you might say, yeah, forms aren't like that. A form really does express a nature. It has a unity, and yet it raises the problem, right? We're going to determine this in some way by virtue of a match between a concept and a form, which has a unity that this doesn't necessarily have. But what exactly is that relation? And so the puzzle we saw was it's very hard to track that down. And really the Platonic dialogues don't help us very much. As we saw, we get metaphors here. In the Meno, a metaphor of recollection. In the Republic, this metaphor of the good shedding light on this realm. All of those are going to be taken seriously by Philo, but all on its own terms. There's not really an account of how he knows. You can look at what Socrates does and try to draw some inferences. And indeed, he relies on other forms. Well, we know about this, right? And uses them to illumine some other form. And yet, how do we know about this whole realm? How do we know where we can start? It's very difficult to sort this out. There is a logical relationship between the form and the object, which enables us to get an objective truth. But until we know how we can know the forms, it's hard to see how that can help us. And so, it's easy to see how, in practice, Platonism led to a kind of skepticism. People lost any sense that they could really figure out how to account for this connection of forms. That's partly a theoretical problem. How do we know these forms, since they exist outside of space and time? They exist outside of any individual mind. It's a puzzle how we can interact with them in any sort of way. And so how do we know them? It's also a practical problem. You claim to have this conception of justice, I have this conception. How do we sort out who's right? It's very hard to see how we use the forms to actually do this. Now, Philo observes this and says, well, we need to go back to the conception of the world as it starts. You might think you should start by focusing on this problem. I don't think that's how he does it. In the account of the world's creation given by Moses, what he does is say, think about this connection first. The connection between the form and the object. I said earlier that was basically a logical relationship of participation. The object is a banana to the extent that it participates in the form of a banana, for example. Okay? It is round to the extent that it participates in the form of roundness, and so on. But now, how did that happen? How did the world get that? Well, he says, we've really got to account for creation. He says, yes, well, let's see. Moses had it all figured out, he says. He was well aware that it's indispensable that in all existing things there must be an active cause and a passive subject, and that the active cause is the intellect of the universe, thoroughly unadulterated, thoroughly unmixed, superior to virtue and superior to science, superior even to abstract good or abstract beauty, while the passive subject is something inanimate and incapable of motion by any intrinsic power of its own. Okay, so it has been set in motion and fashioned and endowed with life by the intellect, became transformed into that most perfect work, this world. So, here's the idea. The world, i.e., for example, this object, the banana, the whatever it is, that is something that is itself a creation. Okay? Now, it was created according to, well, an intellectual plan. And so the third thing I want to talk about today, the problem of evil, we're going to need to trace out this creation and try to figure out what it means. So how does the world actually get created? Well, let's draw an analogy. Several times, Philo talks about the analogy between this and any other kind of construction. What was God doing in creating the world? Well, think about what happens when somebody builds a building. How does that take place? What happens when somebody builds? They do, okay, but first, before they lay a foundation or start actually putting things together, whatever, there's an architect who develops a plan, right? So we're going to have, at the ultimate foundation of creation, God. But you might say, God doesn't do this just willy-nilly. It's not like a kid in a sandbox just playing around at random, and then you say, oh, what is that? The kid just makes it up on the spot. What it looks like. It's just, I mean, there are versions, right, according to which that's what creation was like. In that Gnostic version we thought thought of, is because Sophia gets all unhappy, right? And that, something more or less happens at random unplanned. But not here, no. There is a plan. So God acts as, if you want to think of it this way, the architect of creation, develops a divine plan. And this is something done in the intellect. Now, this divine plan is something that itself, according to Philo, includes the realm of forms. There is a kind of divine intellect here that has a series of ideas. And so, contained in this intellect is the logos, the word. Wow, too many parentheses. But you might say, all right, first thing to notice about the realm of forms then, the realm of forms, these are not just abstract things floating in space. It's hard to say what they are, what this realm of forms could be like. He dubs this the intelligible world. And the intelligible world here, this realm of forms, is, well, what? It is part of the mind of God. Okay, so this is the divine intellect here. The realm of forms we don't want to identify with the divine intellect, but on the other hand, these are ideas in the divine intellect. So the form is one of God's ideas. Now, that's part of what we need for creation. We need a plan, and that plan is going to have to be put together out of divine ideas. So far we've got, an architect who's working with certain intellectual materials, and those include the forms. Now, Philo has a lot to say about the word, the logos. It is somehow the seat of the forms. It is either to be identified with the intellect, or at least it has a close relationship with the intellect of God. He sometimes refers to the logos as the Son of God or the second God. But he doesn't mean that to be taken literally. He doesn't have a two-God view. This does, from a Christian point of view, feel like an anticipation of Christianity. On the other hand, for him, this is just part of the intellect of God. Now, what else do you do when you build something? Think about building a building. Go to an architect, you have a plan, then what? You want to build a house, for example. So you think, yes, I want to build a house. You go and get a house designed for you. Now what? Aha, good, you need materials. And so there are going to have to be materials for this construction. There's going to have to be something, in this case, for the creation of the world, matter. So you're going to need that. What else?
People.
People, yes, you're going to need builders, right? You're going to need workers. So let's take that bit by bit. Will you just start hiring individual workers yourself? I mean, you might. Steve Phillips, my colleague, actually built a house that he designed himself, and then he just acted as his own contractor and hired each individual worker. He did it all by just putting it all on his credit card. It's really kind of amazing. But anyway, yeah, so you're going to have workers, but how does that go exactly? Most people don't just hire the workers themselves. They do what? Yeah, exactly. They get a contract, right? So you've got this contract. If all of these belong together as part of the plan, then you think, well, I need a contract. I need a builder, in other words. And the builder may well hire subcontractors. The builder is going to hire plumbers, electricians, all of that kind of thing. And those are going to hire workers. So we've got this family here, you might say, of people who actually do the building. You can maybe see, actually, now the connection between some of the things going on with Timaeus, the demiurge, the sort of divine intellect coming from the plan, and so on. You've got the materials here. What else now? You want them to be implementing the plan, right? So you're going to have some connection between these things. Eventually here you want the building. So in this case, the divine creation, you want the world. Now if all this goes well, what will be the relationship between the world and that divine plan? It'll match, right? Now this in the real world doesn't always happen. You look at the houses that exist, you look at the plan, and you realize, wait, Yeah, the guys up here tweeting going, yeah, wait, that wall was supposed to go there, right? Or, hold on a second, that pipe was supposed to go up, 6 feet over that way. Or, yeah, real world building often ends up, not that great. But on the other hand, the ideal is that there's a causal relationship here, there's a match here, the structure of the world is supposed to reflect the plan. Yeah.
At this point in time, the world is created here by this divine plan. Is the world the divine plan? Like if we think of a God in his mind and him creating the world, he created it through the materials. The idea in his mind is not the world, right? So they're not physically the same thing.
No, right, exactly. Oh, absolutely. I mean, the blueprint, right, is not the same as the house. And so the plan in the divine mind here is not the same as the world. It would be a mistake to identify those. On the other hand, one is supposed to be structured by the other, right? And so here is part of Philo's answer about how it is we know about the realm of forms and why this sort of match gives us a ground for objective truth. It's not that there's just a logical relationship, it's not just some magic thing. It's because God is here as the builder, he says, basically making the match. The thought is really this. You've got the divine intellect putting its stamp on the world. And so here is the sort of idea. The builder builds according to the divine plan. So there's an arrow that goes this way. God is coming up with a plan. The plan is implemented by the builder. That gives the structure of the world. So of course there's a relationship between the structure that exists there in the intellect and the structure of the world. He often expresses it this way. The world has been stamped by the mind of God. The mind of God has come up with a plan for the world and has stamped it, and so the world reflects the concepts that are there in the divine mind. Yeah.
Is the logos sort of that stamp? Because in scripture, logos is translated as word that could be extended to mean ordering principle or reason.
Exactly. Logos here is often translated as words, but it really does mean something like reason, ordering principle. It's a very, very broad thing. So it's really structure, if you want to think of it that way. There is a structure here in the divine intellect. That structure is reflected by the structure of the world. Yeah.
Just I know this is a question, I don't want to spend too much time, but does logos correspond to like the form of forms? Like the form, that higher abstract form of a set of forms?
Okay, good question. How does it relate to an individual form, for example? Is it the form of forms?
Because I don't know, just...
Yeah. Right, what would Philo say?
Because you would have like at a higher abstract level, a form of forms, like the good.
Right.
So then would that be identical or something?
Yeah, that's a hard question. No, really, there's a very hard question lurking under here, which is, what exactly is this logos? Is it just the collection of forms themselves? Is it the form of forms? Is it the mind in which the forms, these are ideas after all, are being thought? I think Philo is never absolutely clear about this. He says things that suggest each one of those conceptions. And so there are moments where it sounds like he is saying that the logos is the form of forms. There are other places where it sounds like, no, the logos is the active principle. It is the active intellect thinking the forms. There are other places where it seems like, well, the logos is something like the divine mind, in which, maybe that's the same thing, or is it the collection of objects of the divine mind? All of this seems to me a little bit unclear in his thought, and something that the later tradition clarifies. Part of the difficulty in Philo is that he's writing these works on works of scripture, and so the philosophy comes at certain points. You'll go from page after page after page where he's discussing scriptural interpretation of Moses, for example, and then all of a sudden, bam, 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 bam. You get really, I think, deep and important philosophy, but then it's back to the scriptures. And so, really, these are interspersed in long works with just a few pages of philosophy. So you grab a few pages here, a few pages there, you try to put them together. They were written at various stages of his life, and so it's it may be that these are some of the questions on which he changed his mind. We don't know exactly when the various works were written, so it's hard to really trace the full progression. So I think the answer is just, that's a great question, and it's something that I don't think there's really a settled opinion about. Yeah.
So we've concluded that the form and the object are related in some way by nature. The form creates the object from an idea.
Right.
But can we understand what the object is without understanding the form? Can we make true statements about the object without truly knowing the form?
Good question. And I think the answer is no. The reason is this. I've drawn God up here, but I think that's kind of a mistake because this is supposed to be the divine intellect, so God is already over here, really. The significant thing is God is not only, you might say, the mind thinking these forms, but also the mind that is giving a stamp through creation to the world. So creation, I don't know how to draw this, but anyway, creation is part of what is creating this match between the object and the realm of forms. But at the same time, what is God doing? God creates us. Okay? And we are created in the divine image. We are made in the image of God. What does that mean? Philo says, does it mean I look like God? God looks like me. God's about 6 feet tall, wears striped shirts all the time. No, right? It's something about the intellect. And so the idea is, look, it's not just that God is stamping the world with this stamp, so that the object matches the form. God is stamping our minds with the same stamp. Okay? And so the mind comes structured in such a way as to mirror the forms. It's not, in other words, that there's a direct arrow between the form and the mind. It's rather that God is shaping the mind, God is shaping the world, and uses the same blueprint to shape the world. Yeah?
So that's also saying I can't know a piece of fruit, an apple, without knowing the grower that made it.
No. It's just that, basically, to know anything, to have any concept at all, you have to have certain intellectual abilities. Where do the intellectual abilities come from? The idea is they come from God. God has given you whatever intellectual capacities you have. Now, does that mean, wait, God had to give you specifically the idea of a piece of chalk? No. But God gave you the raw materials out of which you can construct that. So it's not meant to deny any role for experience or something like that. It's just that these, if you want to think about this way, these concepts aren't really to be viewed as images or something like that. They're intellectual abilities. And those are intellectual abilities to draw certain distinctions, to recognize things, which are themselves given to you by God in a way that matches what's really there in the world to be recognized and discovered, because both are stamped, you might say, with the same stamp. So if we have God here, the thought would be, well, he's creating the human mind in his image and also creating the world in terms of the plan conceived by that. So yes, there is a kind of isomorphism here that enables us to think about the world as it is by way of the forms, but it's really because both are stamped with the mold of the divine intellect. Yeah.
I still don't think I answered the question why we have different concepts of different objects. Because if like our minds
okay,
the
good.
same way,
Yeah, all right.
why do we still come to different conclusions about the concepts of different objects?
Good. Yeah, excellent question. How is disagreement possible? Because you might say, all right, this is a very nice, I see how now it's possible for us to actually discover something about the nature of the world and have some contact with this realm of forms. But wait, isn't it too good of an account? After all, doesn't this mean that your idea of justice and my idea of justice both are the impressions of the divine idea of justice? Well, yes, that's what gives us hope of knowledge of what justice is. But then how can we ever disagree, right? We've got the same stamp. They ought to match up precisely. So why don't we, in fact, match up precisely? Why isn't it that there's any disagreement? Yeah.
Stamps don't always match each other. You have one stamp it several times. Not all of those results look the same.
Ooh, okay, good, yes. Take a stamp and stamp it on various things. Will they always match up precisely? Ooh, not always, right? Now, what can be the variation? Now, if there are different stamps, and basically, here is, I think, the way to understand Descartes' evil deceiver image in the Meditations. Wait, what if God uses the wrong stamp? Right? God has stamped the world with this stamp and then says, yes, poor human beings, I'll take this other stamp. And stamp your eyes with it! Now you'll never understand it. Okay? But in Philo, no, of course God's using the same stamp, but you're absolutely right. He has to say, wait, two things stamped don't necessarily agree in all particular things. Yeah.
I was just going to say, it sounds like presumptuous, but as an answer to this question, I think that just some people could be ignorant of the truth and others not, and as they connect disagree.
Ooh, okay, good. One way is, look, it's not as if the stamp, it gives us certain intellectual capacities. Those capacities aren't necessarily actualized. And so, for example, yeah, one person might know something, but the other person doesn't. Yeah, what's something I know you probably don't? Well, let's see. Well, I could take a philosophy example, but that's too easy. Yeah.
Use plantains.
Plantains.
Because some people have experienced them before and other people haven't experienced them.
That's true. How many of you have tasted a plantain? Almost everybody. Okay, yeah, plantains will work. Somebody might know about plantains because they've experienced them, they've seen them, right? But if you're like me, that came late in my life, relatively. I mean, I grew up in the north, and there were no plantains. I saw one for the first time when I was in Costa Rica. Somebody made up some plantains for me. This is wonderful. It's a banana. And they said, no, it's a banana. So, it was really, I guess I was about 30 years old before I ever tasted a plantain. Before that, it wasn't that God stamped my arm with the wrong stamp. No, I just hadn't had the experience which actualized the potential that was already there in my mind. So that can be part of it. People may just not know, right? And that's possible. It's not as if this account is incompatible with ignorance. What he's giving you an account of is the potential of your mind, not necessarily what's actualized at any given time. Yeah.
Do you think that could this boil down to a question of do we discover things? Is all knowledge already present? We're just going about discovering it, or are we inventing things new?
Good. That goes back to the question of basics, right? Because we don't want everything to be given in such a way that there's nothing to discover. But we are given potentials. And you might say, then we have, among the potentials we have are the potentialities to take various things we actualize and combine them and do interesting things with them. So the potential is something that lets us go far beyond the pure raw material. Yeah.
Actually, this is one of the reasons why Lloyd Garrison thinks that Aristotle is a Platonist. He's just modifying Platonic thought to make an account for experiential knowledge, such that by saying that we are given capacities and not just pure forms, that allows us to have capacities that are actualized. But that also means that we're not just given a stamp that is, I just have the form in my mind, I just have to remember it. You actually have to actualize that form through experience over time.
Right.
And thus it's a modification of the Platonic system caused by a human being stamped by an intelligible being. But it's not us total tossing it out.
Excellent point. And in that way, Philo is trying to incorporate both of these, I think, trying to say, look, here's how it is possible for you to learn from experience. You're actualizing these potentialities that you're given. But the potentials, the underlying structure that's there, you realize, that's something given by God, and it's something that matches the objects in the world. And so you've got the potential for real objective knowledge and not really... Now it's odd because he does write that work on drunkenness where he gives you all of these skeptical arguments. But his ultimate position isn't that the skeptic wins. He thinks this is why the skeptic loses. Actually, if we think about this, we think, all right, great. There's this stamp, but of course, this is a question of potential. It is not necessarily actualized. It requires something else to actualize it. So we've got the potential for disagreement here, but also the potential for agreement, because we can come to knowledge, we can actualize the structure. So it's not as if we're born just knowing everything about the world. Now, in fact, suppose we turn to knowledge of God. So, can we know something about God? After all, this is to explain how it's possible for us to know things of the world. Can we know about God?
God has knowledge of the forms, right?
Yes, and the forms are there in the divine intellect.
Is he the only one that truly knows the forms?
Well,
or is to say we can only have concepts of the forms?
presumably, since it's the divine ideas that are actually being stamped upon both the mind and the world, and enable this sort of match to take place, it must be possible for us to have knowledge of the forms. However, at least some of the forms, right? Now, does the structure of my mind match the structure of God's mind exactly? No, right? Any more than the stamp and the thing it's stamped on end up resembling each other precisely. And so, can I know God? He gives two answers, really. First part is, well, I can know that God exists. And Philo gives an argument for the existence of God that is the first instance of it that I'm aware of, really. He's giving an account of how it's possible for us even to have the concept of God. He says, yes, he embraces that beautiful world which is perceptible only by the intellect, as the account of the first day will show. For God is apprehending beforehand as God must do, that there could not exist a good imitation without a good model, and that of the things perceptible to the external senses, nothing is defaultless which was not fashioned with reference to some archetypal idea conceived by the intellect. He is determined to create this visible world previously formed, the one which is perceptible only by the intellect, using the incorporeal model. Now, how do we know anything about this? Well, he says, suppose somebody finds a city, okay? When any city is founded through the exceeding ambition of some king or leader who lays claim to absolute authority, but is at the same time a man of brilliant imagination eager to display his good fortune, it happens in time that some man coming up who from his education skillful in architecture sees the advantageous character and beauty of this situation, sketches everything out in his mind, and then builds the city, the temples, gymnasia, Britannia, markets, harbor, docks, streets, the arrangement of walls, dwelling houses, public and other buildings, blah, blah, blah. Okay, so having received in his own mind on a waxen tablets, for example, the form of each building, he carries in his heart the image of a city and then creates it. Now, we see the city, okay? So we have this idea. What do we infer from that? He says, is there anybody who could walk into a city and think, or at least a beautiful city, not maybe a dumb, but a beautiful city, and think, gee, nobody planned this, nobody designed this? Now, okay, well, if the city is Houston, the answer is yes. But he thinks, look, it's so beautifully laid out, people are going to think there's a design. So similarly, you see the world structured in the way that it is. Of course you're going to think there was a designer to the world. So his idea is a version of what later becomes known as the argument from design. He ends up saying, the world shows elements of a design. It's as if the world was created according to an architect's plan. And so it makes sense to infer that there was an architect and some being responsible for building this. Now, as it's laid out in Philo, it's not very precisely designated. It gets later developed in the tradition, but in his version, it's really kind of fragmentary. Moreover, it's really an argument that we can have a concept of God. That among the forms we can know is, you might say, the form of God itself. So we can know something about God, we can have the concept of God. Yeah?
In the case of the world, we can assume that God designed the world, but in the case of Houston, we have to say this man designed Houston, God designed Houston through this man. That we have to put one in between the other.
Well, that's why I used Houston as an example. There are cities like Washington, D.C., that really were designed by a person, Paul. But Houston wasn't designed by any one person. Nevertheless, it's beautiful. I mean, I love Houston. It's a libertarian's paradise. Okay, it's just like, yeah, whatever. And so, it's beauty arising not from one person's design, but just from a bunch of stuff happening. But he's sort of saying, no, I mean a city like Washington, I mean a city like Rome, I mean a city like Athens or something where there really is a design. However, he says, look, we can't know much about God, okay? We cannot know God's nature. Why? Because we've been stamped with this stamp. But that doesn't make our mind equal in capacity to the intellect of God. God is capable of knowing God, but we aren't. We can have the concept of God, but we have a mind that is only partially structured in comparison to the mind of God. Okay, we're finite beings, God is infinite. We have some of the intellectual capacities of God, but not all of the intellectual capacities of God. So we've been given a potentiality that matches the structure of the world, but nevertheless, it is not something that gives us the capacity to actually understand the details of God. Now, we know something, right? Because we know we've been created in the image, that this is in some way an image of that. But to know what this is, that goes beyond our ability. Now, the third problem I want to talk about, and one we're really well prepared to talk about now, is the problem of evil. Maybe the most significant argument against the existence of God, all the way through the history of thinking about questions of the existence of God, is the argument for evil. And I've not got a space in the blackboard to lay out the full argument, but it's basically, God is all-knowing, all-powerful, and all-good. Well, if God is all-knowing, he knows how to prevent evil. All-good wants to prevent evil. All-powerful can prevent evil, so why is there evil? So let's put this into our picture. God here is entirely good. The world contains some evil. Where did it come from? So here's a way of thinking about it. You've got this idea, you're going to create a house, then you move into the house, and it's got some defects. Okay, there's some things wrong with the house. Yeah, my house. The balcony leaked. It took years to really figure this out. When they took apart the back end of the house to find out how serious the damage was, it was held together by slugs. Basically, I said, now, if it wasn't for all of these slugs in here doing things up, the house would just fall. Now, okay, there was a defect. So where did the defect come from? I mean, what's the problem, right? If this contains evil, but the creator here is all good, where's the problem? There are a number of options here. You might say, okay, well, first option really would be God, okay? And indeed, many religions at the time said, yeah, God can't be entirely good, or at least the powers behind the universe can't be entirely good. Maybe the most popular religious orientation outside of the Judeo-Christian tradition or the Greek sort of Roman polytheistic tradition was one that said there's a good principle behind the universe and an evil principle. And so it might be that there's a good creator here, but there's also wickedness, and so there's an evil being behind that. So that would be one account, to say, wait a minute, this whole account of who's behind creation is not right. It's not just one entirely good being. Second option is to say there's something wrong with the plan. Well, now, Philo is certainly not going to say there's something wrong with God, or there's another co-equal but evil being. He's not going to say there's something wrong with the plan. Why? Because the plan is created by divine intellect. And so if it's a bad plan, that suggests a defect in God. So that can't be. What about the contractor? Well, the contractor's God, right? In the Christian tradition, this becomes God the Father. Here's God the Son. So it's like, I'm not going to blame the contractor, but that's an option. Fourth option, it could be bad materials. That's Plato's own answer. It's the answer of some of the Gnostics. Look, I made the world better. Ooh, bad choice of materials, right? Can Philo adopt that answer? Not really. Why is God choosing crummy materials? I mean, this is God, the all-powerful, all-good, all-knowing being. Surely God can pick good material. Yeah.
When we were describing contractors and subcontractors earlier, we were talking about actual people in regards to a specific part of the world.
Right.
So when does God cease to be the contractor and actual licensed contractors start to be contractors?
Okay, good. Yeah, option 5, it's the subcontractors. Okay, God the Father, had the right plan, was going to do everything right, but didn't really build the world entirely himself. Subcontracted it out. To whom? The angels. Okay, so Philo's ultimate answer is, there's your problem. Okay, he hired the angels. Are angels perfect? No. They're very good. Best subcontractors subcontractors he could have hired, the fact that they weren't perfect, that's where things went wrong. And in fact, this is Philo's argument for the existence of angels. We know angels had to exist because otherwise where the evil comes from. Yeah.
Why does not just today need subcontractors?
That's a good question. Why God do it then? Now, okay, there are really only two other options in our closing moments. One is, look, there are the users. Okay? Maybe there was nothing wrong with the house. Maybe I screwed it up somehow. And so that's a possibility. That's been a common option, actually. This is called the free will defense. It's we human beings who have screwed it up through original sin or in some other way. Philo doesn't himself adopt that answer. Why? Because he says, we were created by God, so actually, if we're evil, the source of evil, I don't see how that helps, because God created us. But anyway, we'll come back to that. There's one final possibility, and that is to say, oh, the world only seems to be evil, it's not really. Okay? Philo won't take that, and so he opts for number 5. But one thing that his account really does beautifully is lay out for you just what the options are for dealing with the problem of evil. Next time we'll look at origin and see how he developed this in